This is episode 504 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, I think the most timely thing that we're going to talk about is the New Mexico Supreme Court's weighing in once again on the PNM merger proposed with Avangrid. As I understand it, just to set things up for you and your own expertise on this issue, the ball is very much in the Supreme Court's court. That's kind of redundant, but it is.
The ball is in your court. It always is.
The ball is in your court. And they basically said that they are not going to give the decision back or give it over to the newly reconstituted Public Regulation Commission, which I think it's safe to say would have rubber stamped the merger. Instead, the court is going to have hearings and hold on to the decision themselves, and they will be the final arbiters of the merger between PNM and Avangrid. Is that correct? And where do you see this all heading?
Well, so obviously, Paul, you're absolutely right. The Supreme Court, they have oral arguments scheduled for, I believe, September, and stuff is going to happen. But first of all, what is clear is PNM and Avangrid wanted the case kicked back to the PRC to rule on it, and it's assumed that the PRC, as reconstituted under the governor's appointees, would have been friendly to the merger. Well, that's why
the assumption.
That's why they did it that way.
Right.
I mean, that was one of the reasons that they wanted a appointed commission, is to be able to have a little more political control over it. So the Supreme Court may rule on the merits of that merger, but they may not. They may just say, okay, this case is too old. If you want to merge, go back and open up a new case under this new jurisdiction, the new reconstituted PRC as well. I do believe is a possibility. So, yeah, that as I read it, the court, courts tend to want to rule on items of law, not on fact. You know what I mean? And when there's fact issues, they tend to kick it back to the lower courts to decide what the issues of fact are. One of the things that was argued very effectively, I might add, by the New Energy Economy, one was that if you kick it back to the PRC, you've got to open it up completely because so much time has passed. And two, again, I think very appropriately, that the commission was not following its own rules. They had missed the boat by months and months in terms of actually following their own procedure. So I don't think that we know exactly what is going to happen in the future. But one thing is clear, that the merger is certainly not going through until sometime in September, if ever. And there may be a final decision sometime, after those initial hearings, or after a procedure at the Supreme Court, or maybe not. Maybe it has to be reopened completely at the PRC, and then who knows how long that process will be. And then, not to sound like a soap opera cliffhanger, and will Avangrid lose interest in PNM? Will they move on and go elsewhere? That's the other thing that you have to consider. And, the stock market reaction is PNM stock went down because of this. They had to halt trading as the announcement came out. It was a downward turn. There was the merger price was basically priced into PNM stock, and now the markets are not quite so sure that's there. Just so you know, the market is always the market. It's always it's like economics. It's always right in the long term. Or do they have the right call on that? We just don't know. But what it does mean is that there's a lot of uncertainty backing up a step looking at, we had the Energy Transition Act, we have a new commission, we have a lot of problems with the electric system. We're trying to keep a lot of balls moving in the air. And guess what? Summer's coming and there may not be enough electricity to keep the lights on, as the backdrop.
Right. Yeah, the stock price, I mean, and I'm no expert. We don't really dive into stock issues very often unless there's extreme moves on Wall Street, kind of generally speaking. But yeah, the stock PNM did drop, from about $47, $48 down to 45, which is a significant drop. I'm kind of surprised that would even merit a stop and trade, but maybe PNM isn't as broadly traded. It's not like Procter and Gamble or one of these big organizations that tends to be very heavily traded in the New York Stock Exchange. But
yeah, and Paul, I think first of all, you're right. It's not as broadly traded, but keep in mind the purpose is when there's new information,
True.
Unexpected, that it goes down. The stock exchange doesn't necessarily know what's going to happen. The price could easily go up, but they would like that information to be out there broadly before people start to make their trades, I believe. Fair is enough. The logic of it. So
yeah, and so we'll see what the New Mexico Supreme Court has to say in the hearing process, et cetera. Obviously, this thing has dragged out for some time now, and shows no real signs of being completely resolved. We'll just have to wait for the Supreme Court to hold its own hearings and see what their thoughts are on this merger. And it's a long saga. But moving forward, other utility-related issues. Wally, it's funny, you don't think of things like, a heavy snowpack having big impacts on New Mexico's electricity reliability this summer. But at least when it comes to being on the same grid with California and the massive amounts of energy that they require as a state, we know that California, and you can see pictures online of the amount of snow that's fallen and still remains in the Sierra Nevadas, and there's ski areas that are going to be open not just to July 4th, as sometimes is the case, but possibly through until the next ski season kicks off. Anyway, these mountains have accumulated a lot of snow, which means not much in New Mexico because we don't have hydropower. By and large, we have one, I believe, hydropower plant. But
there's a few. There's a little one up on the San Juan River that the city of Farmington uses, but Elephant Butte, there's a couple of other really little ones. But yes, that's not a big deal here.
But in California and Washington State and Oregon, up along the coastline, there are a lot of water power plants, and utility watchers are saying that the fact that sort of electricity has been boosted by hydropower and the snowmelt could alleviate, at least for this year. And who knows what the snowmelt will look like next year. And we may not be out of the woods for this summer yet, but I am hearing from people and reading news reports that at least on the Western power grid, which we share with California, we could be in better shape than expected for this particular summer due to the hydropower boom that we're going to see thanks to the snowmelt.
Yeah, I think there's no question that, having more water means there's more hydro, and in a Western electric grid that is transitioning and turning off power plants very quickly, more quickly than a lot of times they're being added, having more supply, or at least on the high range of what it could be historically, is probably going to be a good thing. The other thing that's interesting is, what will that mean from a price point of view? Because, there's a couple of things in the electricity markets, and one is keeping the grid functioning, keeping the lights on. The other is who benefits from that. So, if it gets real hot, does that mean that those that own that power in California are going to make a lot of more money than they would have otherwise off of Arizona and New Mexico? That remains to be seen. But in general, in general, I do think it's a good thing, particularly if you're a person that likes air conditioning when it gets really hot, much less if you are somebody that's on an oxygen machine or something else that needs your electricity to be reliable during the summer of 2023.
Yeah, and we have relied upon PNM's own information and media reports indicating that they were really going to struggle this summer and in the future with electricity reliability because of the Energy Transition Energy Transition Act of 2019 and the shuttering of the San Juan Generating Station, which happened at the end of last summer, was delayed by 3 months for political reasons to make sure that we didn't have any issues during the election season last summer. Now, obviously, we're kind of just waiting and watching and hoping. And, we're not going to declare we're wrong because we have a really great snowpack and that helps the Western grid. We will see how this situation evolves and how PNM does at acquiring additional electricity to keep the lights on. So, developing story as they always are. Go ahead.
Yeah, and then just one other point is, this tends to take a little bit of pressure off, but keep in mind on the hottest hour of the hottest day, what's happening in the electric grid. If there's a few power plants that just have the misfortune of being offline that are major providers, and again, we're not probably talking the water-powered plants, but if there's coal or gas plants that are down for maintenance unexpectedly, there's transmission lines that suffer problems. And it still doesn't mean that you're out of the woods, but it does reduce the chances. And you're right. Do we want to count on hydro being huge in California every year as the solution for New Mexico's electric supply transition? I don't think that's a good plan.
Exactly. And of course, that situation is partially driven by the fact that a lot of the wind and solar that is generated here doesn't stay here. It goes to California. And that's just a fact of the electricity marketplace, et cetera. So it's a very complicated thing, as so many topics that we try to deal with here and educate folks are. And electricity and the utility markets, it's certainly hard to say that it's ever been more complicated, at least in modern history, than it is nowadays with the energy transition. It used to be a boring industry, the stock that you would invest in for years and years because they had a high dividend, but were very consistent in their pricing, and that's certainly a change.
Yeah, and in New Mexico. The exception to that, Paul, is California, because California is so smart. They deregulated the entire energy industry and bankrupted one of their major utilities and had problems years ago. And then they had big problems as the climate dried out a little bit and they weren't keeping trees away from their transmission and distribution lines, starting a lot of fires. So they've had a lot of issues there that we have not had in New Mexico. But to be clear, New Mexico was on a path to deregulate when California hit not the speed bump. They were more like a bug splatting into a windshield with Enron gaming the markets and, just the market working much differently than the regulators who put the system in place. And we were on a course to do that too. We were just late, thank goodness, or we would have probably been in the same boat. So yeah, there's a lot of, it's, electricity is, I don't know, I guess it's like space travel or flying on an airplane. If everything goes well, it's the most boring of industries, but if it doesn't, there can be a lot of excitement very quickly.
All right. Well, moving on to mass transit, or just transit because it's kind of lost its mass appeal, whatever there was. Mark Jaffe of the Cato Institute had an excellent blog post in which he showed the passenger trips nationwide on transit systems. It had been kind of peaking out at 10 billion, bumped up and around that threshold for some years, and then just absolutely collapsed during COVID, down to about 4.5, 5 billion annual passenger trips in this country. Rebounded ever so slightly to maybe close to 6 billion, but shows no signs of recovering. And we've talked at the same time on this show about rail runner ridership, Albuquerque bus ridership. I'm sure the same is true for Santa Fe and Las Cruces buses, although data is a little bit harder to come by with those folks. The fact is that transit ridership is down and probably not coming back anytime soon because the workplace has fundamentally changed, especially for people who have to take a bus or a train. COVID either gave them reminded them about how much time they were spending on a train specifically up to Santa Fe, or gave them the incentive to rework things with their jobs and either move closer or more likely to get some kind of remote situation going using internet technology. That is certainly happening. Of course, in other major cities, certainly on Albuquerque's buses, but New York, we've seen a very, very kind of public incident of mentally ill homeless man causing a problem and somebody reacting on that. And, you know, if you feel like you are unsafe on a transit system, you're not likely to want to regularly ride that system. And Albuquerque Journal had a editorial along those lines, which relayed information I hadn't seen from Hector Balderas, the former Attorney General, saying that shoplifters are using the city's free buses. The city of Albuquerque has a free bus program that they are walking out of stores in and around in Albuquerque area, and 10 of the 31 people arrested used a city bus as their getaway vehicle. It's just insane the way we are paying and now further subsidizing crime in our city through the bus system.
Yeah. Many unexpected consequences of government policy aren't as unexpected as you would think. But I would have to admit, Paul, that the buses were a major source of travel for the shoplifting gangs operating in Albuquerque came as a surprise to me. But there's just so much to unpack here. It's the intersection between like in Albuquerque, between the bus system, overall crime. Now that you don't have to pay, there's just a lot of things happening. And further to add to the complexity, the city of Albuquerque has to close bus routes because they can't get bus drivers because nobody wants to drive the bus with the current clientele and the current state of safety and, pay and working conditions and all of that. So there's just a lot going on. But then to cut to, the mass transit has always been such a huge investment, and when I say huge investment, I don't mean return on investment. It's easy to dump money into it. It's not that easy to get a return from it, but it's interesting. And we've talked about this before, how Zoom has probably done more to reduce car and bus needs of travel of any kind, airplane, than all the mass transit systems, combined in the country in terms of what its impact is. And I think that right now, and at least in Albuquerque, the quote mass transit, it's in definite danger of crumbling into obscurity. You know what I mean? Because there are all of these factors, any one of which would be would be enough to impact the ridership, but you put them all together, and it's a pretty bleak situation, indeed. Now, who rides the bus? A lot of people ride it because they absolutely have to. Their current short-term situation is they don't have the resources or wherewithal to get to jobs or get to transportation. But a lot of people are there and they would like to, but if it gets to be too big of a pain, they're going to figure other things out, whether it be carpooling, moving, getting new jobs, lots of other things. So yeah, that we've got a lot going on with our transit system in Albuquerque, and I think unfortunately tied up with so many other broader societal issues that we're dealing with here in Albuquerque that it's hard to figure out just what the transit impact in and of itself is.
Yeah, and yeah, the thing that kills me, metaphorically speaking, is that you're imagine all of the different factors that have to contribute to somebody using a bus as a getaway vehicle for a crime. So first and foremost, shoplifting. We know that the laws and frequently store policies are very geared towards employees of said stores, allowing those
hands
people
off.
to leave.
Yeah, you got to let them go.
So you've got permissive policy on the storefront, maybe or maybe not some security guard that may or may not be willing to engage with the shoplifter. They run or maybe walk out of the store with all of these items. And I mean, let's face it, anybody who's tried to get to a bus or a train or whatever, that the schedule is kind of, you either have this schedule memorized in your head and you know exactly when that bus is coming, or that there is so little willingness to stop you that you can stay at that bus station for 5, 10, 15 minutes, just hanging out with an armful of stolen goods. And then you're at the bus. None of the other bus riders says or does anything, which I understand that. And then you get on a bus with a bus driver who either has to understand that you're doing some massive Christmas shopping, or you more likely are stealing
on a weekly basis.
Yeah, and maybe they have a security guard with them on the bus, because some of those buses have security guards. I mean, if I'm a bus driver, the last person I want getting on my bus is some guy with an armful of stolen property. That's not a good thing for them, because you never know what that individual could do. It just, the way this entire issue has permeated not just our city, but our society is mind-blowing. And the idea that, so many different levels of individual action or systemic action that could put a stop to, or at least minimize this kind of behavior, that none of that is done. It just, it's enough to drive one bonkers. Let's just say that.
Yeah. And then Paul, just, slightly flippantly, but if you're stealing stuff and you're in a car and you're pulled over and arrested in that car, whether it's your car or somebody else's car, that car is going to be impounded and something bad's going to happen. And remember when Albuquerque had the over-the-top civil forfeiture laws? I mean, do we need to do a civil forfeiture law to where if you take the bus, we need to impound that bus and take it away from the city because they're enabling crime to happen?
Imagine the savings to the taxpayers.
Oh, exactly. All the way around, that could be a good thing. And again, not in favor of this abusive civil forfeiture, which is just a way. It was basically legalized government theft, but that made taxation actually look kind and gentle, that civil forfeiture. But the city has a culpability to deal with that in and of itself. It's like, if your system is so bad that it becomes the transportation mode of choice for crime, what does that really say? So,
yeah, crazy stuff. Well, I don't know how to connect this, but it does involve automobiles, and it also involves, if you will, a form of theft. In this case, primarily theft of society and specifically the automobile manufacturer's wealth, thanks to bad public policy. I'm talking, of course, of electric vehicles. Ford announced their first quarter results recently. Our friend Robert Bryce, an energy analyst who writes regularly on these issues, he did a very simple back of the envelope analysis and found that based on the amount of money that Ford was spending and the reported 722 million loss on its electric vehicle business over the first 3 months of 2023, selling 10,866 EVs. You calculate that, and Ford is losing, at least in the first quarter of 2023, $66,446 on every electric vehicle sold. This, of course, is the whole electric vehicle market is not driven by free markets and consumer demand. There's certainly people who like Teslas, and that's fine. Although I'd be interested to see what the market for Teslas was in the absence of government mandates. While the governor of New Mexico, Michelle Lujan Grisham, was criticized by her environmental base for vetoing a EV subsidy, it's not like she isn't dedicated to electric vehicles. She signed a $10 million spending bill for New Mexico electric vehicle charging stations on top of $38 million from Washington. She's been very pro EVs. The military, even under Biden, is claiming that we're going to have wartime vehicles, tanks, and the like running on electricity. Every aspect of government is dedicated to electric vehicles. So it's not a surprise that these manufacturers feel that they need to salute and take it in the shorts to the tune of 66,446 on every EV they sell. But that's with a boatload of subsidies and mandates. Maybe the technology will get better, but boy, if we're going to really deploy these EVs at a large scale, it's going to require much more wealth destruction and much more subsidization.
Yeah, I do believe that is accurate. And, there's a fundamental issue, and really there's two when it comes down to the EV market. And one is charging stations and two is batteries. And so, there is certainly, and it's no accident that the initial success in the EV market was certainly a higher price vehicle, the Teslas, because those batteries are very, very expensive. But also, Paul, keep in mind to tie the first story to the third story together, those same batteries are kind of increasingly relied on to keep the electric grid stable with wind and solar. And it's not clear right now that we can move as quickly as we're moving using lithium batteries, both for utility scale projects as well as for electric transportation. And to add insult to injury, guess what? The more cars that you're going to be filling up with electricity at charging stations, the more likely you may have grid problems. So there's a lot going on here, and it's one of those things. If the government makes all gas or diesel powered vehicles illegal at some point in time, that $700 billion loss of Ford will be a pittance. They'll be well positioned, but it's certainly how this thing plays out as it starts to scale is far from a foregone conclusion. We're seeing a lot of cracks in a lot of places that probably would have happened for practical and technological reasons. But then, as you say, the government, in terms of subsidies and rules, has their thumb so squarely on the scales, tipping it towards EVs. It's very possible that they could be setting up things for a disaster, both either in the transportation sector, the electric generation and distribution sector, or both.
No doubt. And something that we're very much wishing for a freer market. Nothing at all against EVs if folks want to use them and buy them themselves, but gas-powered vehicles got going, so to speak, over a century ago, largely in the absence of subsidies. And there's one of the things that I always argue with our friends on the left is they like to throw out, gasoline is subsidized by American foreign policy and the roads and blah, blah, blah. Well, there are debates to be had over all of these things. Of course, America's pretty oil independent nowadays. So it's really hard to say currently that U.S. foreign policy, as an example, is being, propping up the oil and gas markets. But there are government responses to the free market, and I would say that especially when you talk about roads and the subsidization of those. I mean, I can envision a free market road infrastructure, but
they exist.
yeah, foreign countries, European countries, plenty of toll roads over there.
Mexico has a lot of toll roads. So.
Yeah, those are policy decisions and stuff that we did differently. But this is clearly the government getting in at the ground floor, if you will, of a market that really didn't exist, and pushing very, very hard with a lot of money on something that is not entirely new technology. Some aspects are new, but electric vehicles have been around for a very long time, and it's very much something that I think government tends to overpromise and underdeliver while spending lots and lots of our money, or in this case, often Ford's money, through the cost transfer. So. Interesting stuff.
Yeah, and unless you think gasoline isn't important, not only to the everyday Americans, but to the Biden administration and those in Washington, why did we take all of our oil out of the strategic oil reserve when prices were just a little bit high? They weren't even outrageous by historical standards. As a political decision, it's one of those things. I think that just shows right there. Yeah, gas. It's one of those. Whether you love or hate oil and gas, it's tough to get through your daily life for a few seconds or minutes, much less a day, without having a lot of that directly and indirectly come in contact with your life.
Yeah, and I didn't put the story in line. Sometimes I'm purposeful about these things. This one is more random. There's been some debate, and justifiably so. It's often. Land use and zoning are kind of the corollary to the old Mark Twain quote about whiskeys for drinking, waters for fighting. Zoning and land use changes are often with the same have the same impact. And Mayor Keller is, for lack of a better word, trying to liberalize somewhat some of our land use planning here in the city of Albuquerque. By allowing for casitas, which are separate housing units, and duplexes, presumably taking current houses and splitting them up in some way and allowing them to be true multi-family units. And, I think this is a challenging issue because there are neighborhoods where, Albuquerque is not known for having gigantic yards, back or front, because people can only handle so much xeriscaping. Right. You do have older neighborhoods with large, grassy, open backyards. Sometimes they're grassy, sometimes they're just dirt or weeds. And it's a complicated issue because once you put a broad policy out that is permissive, as Keller wants to do, you can wind up with things that don't work, don't look good, cause issues, including, to take the stretch, to vehicles, parking issues are certainly a factor. But I do think the casitas and duplex, while Keller has pushed them together, I look at it on the casita issue especially and say, well, there are places where casitas make sense, and I think there might be some kind of, and I haven't seen this, there a requirement that the backyard has to be a certain size in order to accommodate a casita. I think that might be a reasonable requirement, but Pete Dinelli, who is a former mayoral candidate, certainly of the left. So this is kind of a, everybody's interested, but this is a public battle right now between Dinelli, who pretty much opposes what Keller's doing, Keller, who's pushing this issue, the mayor. I think, broadly speaking, we fall down more on the mayor's side, but I think he's maybe doing some things that need to be studied a little more closely, and like that issue of the backyards, parking issues should certainly be addressed. I'm not as big of a fan of duplexes as I am of casitas, especially with the aging population we have in this city, in this state. You know, a lot of casitas could be occupied by, for lack of a better word, little old ladies who either don't drive or are minimally invasive in the kind of occupying a lot of space and requirements. So anyway, thoughts
or methamphetamine labs, depending on who you rent to. So I mean, you know, obviously we're hoping that our grandma isn't cooking meth in the backyard, but you know there are issues. And you know, Paul, the place I started with this is that you know this is Albuquerque is a huge zoning city. We're
very intensive.
Huge. There are cities that have little to no zoning. Houston being the one I'm most familiar with. That a lot of parts of Houston don't have any zoning. And you know what? Guess what? You wouldn't necessarily know it by driving around there. You know, neighborhoods have developed, industrial areas have developed, etc. But New Mexico has a long, long history of zoning. And so, yeah, what is the right way to transition from that? Because, you know, believe me, zoning is certainly not a uniform good that doesn't have a cost. There's a lot of inefficiency that's brought about by that. And then, you know, I've often thought that casita rule made a lot of sense. And so when I saw that, I was like, oh,
you're talking about the revision.
Yeah, the revision to it is like, oh, yeah, I mean, a lot of places allow that, you know, and it's a lot easier to do. But it's almost like the casitas are almost a little bit like the Airbnb phenomenon, which is places like Santa Fe more so, but even Albuquerque. Oh, we hate that short-term rental. It's like bringing flexibility with regard to what the ownership of property, you know, all things being equal. I think that's a good thing, but it won't be without issues. And then the other thing that I wonder is the neighborhood associations. Either because they have it legally or because they've taken it politically. I'm never quite sure about that one. They're hugely powerful in this city. And what's that going to be? You know, so can they run roughshod over them and just say all of those HOA agreements that you did, now that's all null and void and you got to do this? Or is there going to be, you know, a decade of lawsuits, or what's going to happen? Not clear about all of that. But yeah, I just want to say that in general, I think the casita thing is a good thing. You know, just to share, you and I looked at the backyard of a facility near and dear to my heart and said, could it work here? And the answer is maybe. There's a lot of places it could, but guess what? There's a lot of places it can't. And your point's a good one. Where do we draw the line in terms of what you can do? And also on the homeowners association, you know, it's one of those, if you build something that blocks somebody's view, that's akin to fighting for water in New Mexico. You know, if you had a big view of the mountain and now somebody's building a 2-story casita in your view, what's going to happen with that?
Yeah, I'm generally in Rio Grande Foundation, we're not a land use oriented entity. It's kind of like dealing with water. In New Mexico, you really have to deal with water and deal with water exclusively. You have to deal with zoning and land use planning here. But we know we have a housing shortage in the city. We know that there's not a whole bunch of unoccupied land available to do a lot of new housing. There's also no question that there are broad areas of our city, especially in some of the older neighborhoods where you have some nice big backyards that could easily have casitas added to that area. Some of the newer areas, especially the backyards, really are small, and I think there needs to be maybe some consideration there in some of those newer areas, because you're really getting into cramped quarters with some of those parts of town. But big news this week, right up there with PNM, is Holtec, the company that wants to create a nuclear storage facility, interim storage facility in southeastern New Mexico near Carlsbad and Hobbs, received approval from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. This is in direct contrast or countering the wishes of a lot of our supposedly green politicians who want zero carbon energy, want economic development. You can take it from Michelle Lujan Grisham to Martin Heinrich. Melanie Stansbury, our Democrat-controlled legislature, at least a majority of them, who all lined up in support of a prohibition on Holtec's facility. The Journal had a great editorial calling them out, and it really highlights, I think, the hypocrisy, both on the economic development front and on the clean energy front with these left-wing politicians. And we're very happy to see this approved, and it's going to be interesting to see whether there's legal action in the federal courts and whether that legal action has any impact on the facility and whether it's ultimately created here in New Mexico, whether it's built and becomes something that effectively does what it is supposed to do. But I mean, theoretically, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's word is final, especially since this law was only passed right in the end of, towards the final approval of the facility. So I've got to suspect that in a federal court especially, there is a high likelihood that the facility is allowed to move forward. And that is good news for Southeast New Mexico, economic diversification, as well as, I think, the effort to reboot the nuclear electricity generation industry in New Mexico, in the United States, not just New Mexico.
Yeah, and we're starting to see, there are other countries that are starting to take another quick look at nuclear, given all the issues that they're having with Russian energy and energy in general. And it is interesting, Paul. I thought that the Journal editorial was particularly good because I think it hit along. It's like, okay, is this what they're doing perfect? No, but what is the alternative to that? And keep in mind where a lot of waste is being stored is not in places. Guess what? Is in places, including those in New Mexico, that are not as secure, not as environmentally friendly, not as well monitored as this Holtec facility will be. And it's one of those things. The support from afar, the people in Santa Fe are the ones who tell the people in Southeast New Mexico that they shouldn't want Holtec, where the people in Southeast New Mexico in general say, yeah, we're fine with this facility. We've studied it. We think it's a good thing for our community.
Yeah, funny how that works. And again, 400 jobs thereabouts and $3 billion of investments in Southeast New Mexico. Certainly you and I don't see oil and gas going away anytime soon, but you can certainly understand the impetus for average people as well as the leadership of Southeast New Mexico's various communities to really want to see some kind of different job opportunities and economic investment in that area of the state. All right, we are going to leave it there, Wally. So many issues to talk about, so much excitement going on right now still, even though we're well past the legislative session in New Mexico. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointsnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.